Welcome to our session 4 of our Lenten Bible study, Journeying with John. And this week we meet Jesus and a woman of Samaria.
So a reminder that what we're doing by following the passages offered, the gospel passages offered by the lectionary during Lent, is that we are dipping into a series of encounters which Jesus has in John's gospel. Last week in Jerusalem with Nicodemus, this week up north in Samaria with a woman by the well. We'll skip over chapters 5 to 8, and next week we will encounter Jesus as he heals a man born blind in Jerusalem and the controversy and debate that ensues. And actually the debate goes on through chapter 9, chapter 10. And then finally we will come on the fourth of these encounters to Jesus in Bethany, where Lazarus has died. It's important, I think, to remember that John, the alleged author of this gospel, is writing these stories in a gospel that is dated towards the end of the first century. Questions about whether that's in the 80s or 90s or maybe early in the hundreds, but certainly half a century or more after the time of Jesus. So we don't have verbatim accounts of any of these encounters. What we have is a story created with, as I hope you are appreciating as we go through, with quite some literary skill, but also stories which have clear theological points in mind. And we saw that last week in the way that the Nicodemus encounter led into Jesus giving a long speech about the purpose for his coming. And we will see that hopefully this week with the woman and next week with the man born blind. We saw last week that the trajectory of Nicodemus right through the gospel is that he eventually seems to come to faith in Jesus, to the extent that he's taking the risky step of going with Joseph of Arimathea to take the body of Jesus. The question for you to hold in the back of your mind today is, what is the process for the woman? What kind of procedure towards faith do we find in the story of the woman? But we're going to start by setting the scene, and Elizabeth's going to talk about comparing Nicodemus and the woman.
Yes, we met Nicodemus last week, coming to Jesus at night in a private place. And this week we meet the woman coming to the well at the brightest time of the day. So she comes by day, not by night, and she's in a highly public place. So we're posing the question to you, is this time significant? And when we think about this, you might want to think about when Jesus died. The other place noontime is mentioned in this gospel is when Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, "I thirst." Which seems to have some reflection from this story here. And he dies at that time. And also a woman, his mother, who will be addressed in exactly the same way as this woman is addressed, will be given care to the disciple whom Jesus loved, himself a symbol of those who've heard the word of Jesus and come to follow him. So thinking about Nicodemus, who came at night and in private, and thinking about the symbols in John's gospel and what they might mean, our first discussion for you today is to think about what similarities can you find in the two stories, and you should be able to find a number of literary things, and what contrasts can you find in the two stories? I mean, we've already talked about some, but you may be able to find some others. So that is your first task for this morning. Well, welcome back. What did you find?
Could I just make an observation that I was making as we came back to this room? I'd made the statement that I would like to think Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well actually did happen, that they weren't just an invention of the gospel writer, because I've spent most of my life reading the Jesus story and the stories and believing in them. If they didn't happen, if they're an invention of the gospel writers, that's a bit of a challenge to my faith.
Yes, it is challenging. You can't prove one way or another whether these encounters actually happened, particularly as they follow a pattern. I don't know if people detected that there's a pattern between Nicodemus and between this woman, but it's highly unlikely Jesus would have so many encounters that followed exactly the same structure and pattern. Highly unlikely. So that doesn't mean that you have to say the author invented them, but it does mean that whatever his source was for these encounters and stories about these encounters, he's retold them in a very particular way. So it's not saying they didn't happen, but the way John tells them is probably not the way they happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess the analogy is the historical novel. For example, Hilary Mantel telling the story of Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah.
She's taken historical events and then she's woven her own story around them.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, I mean, the chances of anyone knowing exactly what Jesus said to the woman, given that there were only the two of them there at the time,
yes,
are quite small. But that there was an encounter is not necessarily a fiction.
That's right. But John has his way of telling these things, and yeah, the encounter as described by John is, as I said, it's very formulaic.
I think we can get tied up in not worrying about that when we just need to accept it what it is and realise that there may be some other sourcing, but let's take it for what it is as a terrific story which tells us a lot.
Yeah, it's a great story. I love this story.
But the difference I see is, like, on the one hand, you've got Nicodemus, who's the absolute insider, as a member of the ruling council, and a Jew and one of the tribe, and a man. And you get this woman who's an absolute outsider, being both a woman and a Samaritan. But conversely, they come at times which are odd, like she's in broad daylight where everyone can see what's going on, if they were there. And Nicodemus sneaks out in the middle of the night. So quite significant contrasts.
Yes, there's a lot of appositional things or polarities that are in your notes that Bill's noted. She's a Samaritan, he's a Jew, she's female, he's male. Jesus is an insider, Nicodemus is an insider, the woman is an outsider to the Jewish faith. So, and also we're in a desert area, we're not in a built-up town, which we probably were with Nicodemus.
Don't you think that if we were to go with the premise that this really did happen, and considering both people are in a very small town, and we know small towns know everything, wouldn't she have known who he was when he approached her at the well? Wouldn't that have made a difference demonstrated into her portrayed attitude to him in the conversation?
I don't think so. I don't know we can sustain that even as a literary premise, Rosemary, because she just calls him a Jew. She doesn't seem to have any clue. Now, remember, Jesus in the story of John is traveling around. This is the first time he's been to this Samaritan town. The Samaritan town may have heard of this Jewish preacher and healer that's wandering around the countryside. They might have, but that doesn't mean they sent a picture of him in advance. So she would know this was that particular Jewish healer and preacher that she's heard of. So I think we have to assume that he's there for the first time. This is a first time encounter, and she has no way of knowing who he is.
But she's pretty cluey on the living water.
I don't think she is.
No.
I don't think she's cluey on that at all. She gets it much later on, but like everybody who meets Jesus in the Gospel of John, she takes it literally. Initially, she says, give me this water so I won't have to come back to the well. She's confusing the spiritual water with actual water, which is what Nicodemus did. So I don't think she's got it. This is a trope, as I said, John uses all through his gospel. He uses it twice in this passage, once with her and once with the disciples. So neither of them get it, because when he talks about he's got bread other than what they know about, they think, who gave him bread, where clearly he's talking about spiritual bread. So that every encounter of Jesus would happen like this historically is highly unlikely. It's a very constructed story in terms of these literary tropes that John uses. So I don't think we can assume that, even for the sake of the story. I don't think she knows who he is.
Okay.
I mean, she comes to it, but not straight away.
I'm convinced.
The surprising thing about this story is that it ends with a reconciliation between Jews and Samaritans. They're so impressed by Jesus that they invite him to stay for a couple of days and to be with them. And before this encounter with the woman, that would have been impossible. So reconciliation between a group of Jews and a town full of Samaritans.
Yes, don't say it's a reconciliation between Jews and Samaritans. It is not. It is a reconciliation between Jesus the Jew and his followers and a town of Samaritans. So it's not meant to be a universal projection into all Jews, all Samaritans.
Not meant to be symbolic?
No, because they never reconciled, so that would be highly unlikely.
I think the other point of...
Well, it might be symbolic of John's hope, but it's not a sign of what happened in reality. Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, there's something about Jews and Samaritans, because in Mark and possibly Matthew, I can't remember for the moment, there's the story of it's a Syrophoenician woman in one of them, the woman who comes and wants her daughter healed and says even the dogs under the table get the crumbs. So there's this thing in general that Jesus came to create unity or bring people from outside Judaism into God's family or God's realm or whatever. There's that kind of thing but there are different ways of telling it in the different Gospels.
Yeah, well, Matthew doesn't tell that story. I have to say, Matthew twice says, go nowhere among the Gentiles and nowhere among the Samaritans.
Fair enough.
Matthew has two prohibitions against consorting with outsiders. So his gospel does not have Samaritans other than prohibition, and mostly Gentiles are portrayed quite unfavourably, and he turns the Syrophoenician into a Canaanite.
Yes.
That's why Matthew is my least favourite gospel.
Matthew is very interesting. I'm not subscribing to Matthew's theology necessarily, Matt, but I find his stuff really interesting. But yes, he's not very outsider friendly, the Gospel of Matthew.
I think the other significant thing in this story is how the process that's used here, like using the misunderstanding of both Nicodemus and the woman to bring home the point that he's trying to make.
Yeah. Yes. And the same with the disciples. The story with the disciples and the bread is embedded within this story of meeting the woman, and it interrupts the narrative before the town is converted. And they do exactly the same thing. They say, here, teacher, eat. And he says, I have food of which you do not know. And they think he means literal food, where of course he's talking about the bread of heaven, or, spiritual food.
I have not thought before about the fact that Nicodemus encountered Jesus at night and the woman encountered Jesus in the daylight, as just being contrasts between in ways that people encounter Jesus. Because of course I was brought up with the idea that the reason that the woman was at the well in the middle of the day was because she was an outcast and the other women wouldn't talk to her, which is not in fact true.
No.
But I didn't. I had the contrast between Nicodemus and dark and the woman and light had not processed. I had not processed that until just now. So thank you.
Oh, good. I'm glad you got that, Judy, because I've been arguing it that this woman is not an outcast for years now and reminding people this is the Gospel of John. Light and dark and night and day are highly symbolic in the Gospel of John. That she's at the well at noonday isn't meant to be taken as a piece of social, scientific, historical fact that she's an outcast. And clearly she's not, because she goes back to the town and says to them, could this be the Messiah? Come and see this man. You know, could he be the one? And they all do it.
Yeah.
If this woman was an outcast, nobody would have taken a particle of notice of her, because that's how outcasts worked in the ancient world. They all listen to her and they all do as she suggests, and they all end up converted as a result of her and meeting Jesus. She's the first missionary. So if you've been brought up to think like Judy was, that this woman is an outcast, put it in the bin right now, because nothing in the text actually says that.
I'd binned the idea of outcast. I just hadn't realised the symbolism
Yeah, I
in the
get
light and
that,
dark
yeah.
contrast.
Yes. So there's lots of things about this story that are very clear. This woman, she might be a bit placed in an unusual situation, but she's not an outcast in this town.
And also Nicodemus came looking for Jesus, whereas this Samaritan woman was accidental.
She was. He's sitting there and she comes to get water. And there could have been all sorts of reasons, if you want to look at it pragmatically, why someone might come to the well at midday. You know, they might have kicked their bucket over, or the goat might have drunk too much, or there might be a sick child or a sick person. There might need to be some ritual washing. There's all sorts of reasons why you might break the norm that you can look at. But John is a highly symbolic gospel, and he tells his stories very symbolically. And we always have to have that to the forefront of our mind when we look at it. Anything else anyone wants to say?
I think it's interesting that she's not named. Yeah, I find that interesting, because it kind of adds into the symbolism of the story.
Yeah. It's, though biblical women frequently aren't named, so that's not uncommon to have a biblical woman who's playing a reasonably major role in this story not to be named. Men tend to be named, such as Nicodemus was named, but women do not, unless there's someone like the mother of Jesus or Mary Magdalene. For some reason she's named, but there's lots of others who aren't. Okay, we better move on to water and bread, and I think John's going to talk about that.
There's two symbols in this whole passage that prove to be significant in thinking about Jesus. The one in the encounter with the woman is water. And so when Jesus asks the woman for water, and she responds, that Jesus then says he will offer her water that will become a spring of water. This is the living water that is mentioned also in chapter 7. She thinks she mistakenly thinks he's talking about real water, but some kind of special sort of water that means she doesn't have to fetch it from the well at the time. So this is another example of what we saw last week with Nicodemus, of the born again, born from above misunderstanding, and the possible, the wind blows or the spirit blows, that two kinds of interpretations. What kind of water is Jesus talking about? The same kind of misunderstanding kind of sits under the account a little bit later in the scene. John has introduced this story by saying that Jesus was weary. And when Elizabeth and I were doing our Greek study with Andrew Jago earlier this week, we saw that the word that she used there means he was really deeply tired, utterly exhausted.
About to fall over exhausted.
About to fall over, yeah. So maybe that is why the disciples kind of intervene and say, Jesus, you need to eat something. And instead of him saying, yeah, good idea, you know, my blood glucose sugar level is too high, I need to
Too low.
he wouldn't have a clue about that, would he? He says, sorry, too low, yeah. He talks about the food that he has to offer that you do not know about. My food, he says, is to do the will of him who sent me. One of those dangerous verses that taken out of context can justify workaholism, ministerial or discipleship workaholism. We don't want to do that. Anyway, the misunderstanding is between the food that Jesus needs to eat and the food that he says he has to offer, just as earlier in the scene, the misunderstanding is between the actual water in the well that the woman is seeking to get and that Jesus would like to drink from, and the water that becomes a spring of water, an eternal spring of water that Jesus is talking about. So we'll come back to this question of misunderstanding in our next discussion. Do you think that this technique of misunderstanding is effective in this story in either or both of these places? Why do you think John uses water and bread as important symbols? And of course, in the notes, there's some suggestions about water and bread. You might like to talk about that in your group. And what in John's religious tradition, therefore, might be important to understanding the idea of Jesus offering living water and bread. So there's it's asking a cluster of questions there that you might like to spend a bit of time on in your groups.
We were having a discussion, Elizabeth, about how did Jesus know the woman's personal history? If we take a Trinitarian perspective, we'll say he was God from the beginning. God knows everything about everyone. He just knew the woman's history. To me, his knowledge of the woman, that the woman had had 5 husbands, that's an interesting point. How on earth did he know that? And Rosemary was giving us a 3-point answer.
I see. Yes, it is an interesting question. Of course, it's absolutely crucial that Jesus knows that. Why is that?
Because it means people believe, she believes, and the people in the town believe.
Yes, it's crucial because that is the turning point in the discussion in terms of the woman. She's dazzled by the fact Jesus just seems to know this. And that's what makes her start to ask, who is this person? And how does he know this? And what does that mean? It's not the living water that makes her think, yeah, I need this spiritual kind of thing. It's the fact Jesus says, this is your history. And she's quite taken by that.
Because anyone could say, I can give you living water and you won't thirst again. I mean, not many people would, but you could say it.
Yes.
But why would you believe someone? You just go, nuts.
Yeah,
I've just met
exactly.
a nut. But if he can, yeah.
It's almost another sign in a sense. It's certainly a sign for her and a sign for the townspeople that she goes to talk to. So with our questions, do you think the technique of misunderstanding is serving John well?
Yes.
Yes.
Because
I had to confess in the middle of this discussion that I've been reading John for decades, and it's my favourite gospel. And until I read these notes, I didn't ever realise that there was such a thing as Johannine misunderstanding. And I'm glad that I know about that now, because I can see that it's a way for the gospel writer to elaborate on particular theological themes.
Yeah.
That's right.
See, my take on that, Ian, is that John uses misunderstanding so that those who are in the know can wink and nod at each other and say, we know what he means. And those who are outside can go, what the hell is he on about? You're obviously one of the insiders. You've been blessed from the time of your birth by having been, in Johannine terms, by having been chosen to be part of those who know. So there you go.
It's also a good literary device, John.
Yeah, it is.
Because it does what Ian says. It allows Jesus then to explain the spiritual meaning of what he's talking about. And he does it a lot. Once you know it's there, you can't unsee it. And this is the third time he's done it. We're only 4 chapters into the gospel.
He is an artful storyteller.
He certainly is. He's an excellent storyteller. So
yeah,
why,
I mean, so this is the balance that we come at week after week, that because we're people of the Enlightenment and because of how so much of the preaching of the church has been, we've just kind of automatically assumed this is a story about something that happened. Yes, it may well have been a story about something that happened, but we have a story about something that happened. So the story about something that happened has 2 elements. And I guess what we're trying to do in these studies is to highlight the storytelling craft and to see how that actually illuminates and brings more questions. And to just get hung up on, well, how do we know that this happened, is kind of a dead-end track, because it may or may not have happened, but what we have is this wonderful story. And that's the power of myth. Like we've done myth in Old Testament courses too. And the power of myth is that it's a story that really grips and goes to somewhere deep for us.
yes,
Exactly right. And you do this in other Gospels, though, don't you? Like we mentioned in a group about Mark, how he uses the disciples not understanding Jesus when he tells them a plain parable.
Yeah.
Take it aside and say, well, look, this is what I really meant. I'm not going to tell the other people who I told the story to, but I'm telling you the meaning of this parable. So I think that as a device, it seems to crop up quite a bit in the Gospels.
Yeah, it's obviously a Jewish kind of technique, I think, in storytelling. And of course, it helps sink the message in more, because you say something people don't understand and then you repeat it in a more elaborate way. For an oral culture, that is how you teach things and how people remember things. So we need to remember that. What about water and bread? John has picked them as these 2 symbols. Why do you think that is?
They're life-sustaining.
They're life-sustaining, that's right. You can't live without food or water. And bread in its myriad forms is an incredibly important food in the biblical days.
And they're deeply embedded in their culture and understanding of the history.
Yes, because we've got all sorts of watery references from Genesis onwards. And then, of course, we've got the whole Exodus story. We've got water gushing from rocks. We've got manna or bread from heaven. So there's all sorts of divine kind of implications about water and bread as well. But as the 2 essentials for life, they make sense to become symbolic as 2 essentials for faith. And John's got some passages up there at the moment where we've got the NRSV is a bit pragmatic with manna from heaven. It was, a form of food. It's like bread from heaven. So it's really important. Any other comments about water and bread?
They would have been very well understood references in their community. So it's not like he's introducing some new concept, but all this was part of their understanding of their past and in how God has interacted with humanity.
That's right. So it's not like you're choosing, locusts and olive oil. It doesn't have the same sense of being essential to life, being essential to being sustained. And as a corollary of that, it's God who sustains. So it makes sense to use these as symbols.
The symbol of water and bread is carried through to the symbol of the Last Supper?
Yes and no. In the Gospel of John, yes, because, of course, what does Jesus do at the beginning of the Last Supper?
Wash his feet.
He washes feet. He uses water to cleanse. And that's, again, a symbol in John because it's got a double meaning. He's literally cleansing Peter's feet. But his response to Peter when he says, I'm not worthy, is clearly that water is also symbolic of cleansing people spiritually, and part of that. But in the Synoptic Gospels, it's bread and wine that Jesus talks about at the Last Supper, which we don't have in the Gospel of John.
Oh, the water's been turned into wine, obviously.
Well, that's in Cana. Very funny. Water's been turned into wine. Yes, he washed Peter's feet and then turned it into wine. And it was delightful.
Who brought him?
Yeah, who brought
Elizabeth, I think was Bill in our group discussion mentioned that by using the, these symbols of bread and water, in light and darkness, they are not new understanding, they are reinforcing.
Yep.
They are
they
reinforcing an understanding.
Yes, indeed, Otto, because John is not inventing these things. He's drawing them from his religious tradition, which of course goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And he's using them to reinforce something about them. That's exactly right. And he's applying them to Jesus. That's the new bit, because Jesus says he's living water and he is the bread of life. He has ways later on in the long narratives in John of describing himself that draws on that. So that's the new bit in John, applying these to Jesus and Jesus offering these things. But they certainly come from his tradition. And that's really important that we get that.
Thank you.
All right. Believing. What does the woman believe? Well, initially, she's not believing anything at all. If you go back to contrasts and polarities in your notes, you'll note the last paragraph there says she's not very, she's only marginally polite, shall we say. When Jesus says, in the imperative, give me a drink of water. Now, he's saying this to a Samaritan and a woman and a stranger. So he's commanding her, give me a drink. And she does not take kindly to that. And so she says straight off, you, a Jew, how dare you ask me for water? And why didn't you bring a bucket anyway if you're going to get thirsty? So there's a lot of tension set up there initially. As the interaction progresses, she starts to use different terms to describe him. Now, the Greek word Kyrie is used about 3 times here. And it is, it can be translated a number of ways. It can be just a sign of respect, like sir, like, or madam would be the equivalent. So when you arrive at a posh hotel, if you've ever done that, they'll say, hello, sir, can I take your luggage or whatever? She seems to be using it in that sense, at least initially. I would probably want to argue by the last time she's using it in verse 19, it should be translated as Lord, which of course is its other meaning, and often applied to Jesus. So she's going from you, a Jew, to a polite form of social address, sir. And then I think she probably moves to Lord as the congregation progresses. Then Jesus becomes a prophet. Then he's a Messiah, ? So you can see in her conversation, she's moved quite a bit from being borderline rude through to, could this be the Messiah? So she goes through this process in the conversation of believing, and how she addresses Jesus actually reflects how she is feeling about him at the time. So at some point, she's come to some sort of point of belief. She knows Jesus is someone of significance. Clearly, he's at least a prophet. He probably, maybe, is the Messiah. And it's really a journey of discovery. And we know Nicodemus went on a journey of discovery, and by the end, he's clearly a disciple. But this woman's journey of discovery is somewhat accelerated because she finds out all these things pretty much in the course of a conversation. And then by the end of this story, we have Jesus being seen as saviour of the world, and that's being accepted not only by her, but the whole township. Now, the disciples characteristically in the Gospel of John call Jesus Rabbi, which just means teacher. It later becomes a title in Judaism, and the rabbis evolved from the Pharisees. But here it is just a title of teacher, and it's a sign of respect. So, and then Jesus, of course, by the end of the whole story, is Saviour of the world. And when she questions as whether he is the one they're waiting for, i.e. the Messiah, he says, I am he. So here we have one of the I am sayings, and this is the first occurrence of an I am saying. John is famous for them. The Greek phrase is ego eimi, and Jesus makes a lot of pronouncements using this little phrase, ego eimi, I am. So I am he, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, the way, the truth and the life, and I am the true vine. There's quite a number of times when John uses it. It's thought by a lot of scholars to date back to Exodus 3:14, when Moses encounters the burning bush, and when he says, who shall I say you are? Because the bush informs him, I am the God of your ancestors. And Moses says, well, what's your name? Who are you? And the bush says, I am who I am, or something to that intent. So the I am sayings would appear to come from this encounter that Moses has, and Jesus says, I am these things. They're distinctive claims. They're only found in the Gospel of John. They're not in the Synoptics. We don't find them in the letters or other documents of the New Testament. There seemed to be a Johannine thing.
Yeah,
So,
and perhaps the other thing to say here, Elizabeth, is each of these, or most of these, have a good heritage in Hebrew scriptures, that bread,
Yes.
light, shepherds, life, and
Light.
vineyards are all symbols in Hebrew scriptures.
Well, maybe not the resurrection.
No, resurrection is something that comes later, but life, having a good life, or
even something like the way, which we tend to think of as a Christian thing, and the gospel, or the writer of the Gospel of Luke and Acts uses the way a lot, particularly in the book of Acts. The way is used a lot in the book of Job, so it too is an Old Testament thing where there's a lot of play on words about the way to God and Job knowing the way and God knowing the way. And so, but the resurrection is probably the only thing in this that is not found in the Old Testament, where we do find bread, light, shepherds, life, truth, and vines. So we're going to get you to talk about some more questions now in your group.
Elizabeth, can I ask a quick question?
You can.
Are the Samaritans, are they of the Jewish faith?
Sort of. I mean, when the Northern Temple was destroyed, the Northern Kingdom was destroyed, it kind of obliterated them as Jews, and there was a lot of argy-bargy that went on from the return from exile from Babylon.
Well, I mean, the key thing here is that the Assyrians had a policy when they conquered the territory that they would take a whole lot of people as slaves and they would import into the territory people from other places. So
yes,
2 Kings 17 says that there was a whole lot of people,
of foreign women or foreign people came
foreign
in.
people that were brought, and of course they brought their religious practices with them. So although 2 Kings 17 says that they maintained some Jewish, some priests of Moses there to teach people to follow the law, they also had their own practices. So it's what we call syncretism.
So they had their own practices for a long time. I mean, she refers to them, this woman here. She talks about worshipping on the mountains and the high places.
Yeah.
And when the temple was consolidated in Jerusalem, there was a lot of effort to stamp out this worship in the high places. And some of those high places, there was worship of Asherah, for instance. So, but Northern Kingdom men also had married foreign women. And in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they came back from the exile, they were ordered to divorce them and they refused. And so out of all of this mess, you get this rise of the Samaritans, named for the town of Samaria. And basically they follow the same law as the Jews, but they only recognize the Torah as sacred scripture. So the first 5 books of the Bible are the Samaritan scripture. There are some differences between that Torah and the Torah of the Jews. I don't think they're immense, but there are some differences, and that is what they followed. And so, like any family that splits up on bitter terms, they didn't like one another. I mean, they're actually quite close in their customs and practice and what they believe. They're very close.
But they're not
because of this
considered
history.
They're not considered Gentiles then. They are considered.
Oh, no, they're not Gentiles.
Yeah.
But they're considered, I mean, how would you call it? If you've ever seen The Life of Brian, where you watch them watching in the Roman Colosseum, they're up in the seats watching whatever's going on down there. And there's an argument whether they're the People's Judean Front or the People's Front of Judean. And one group says to the other, split up. That's what it was like, this split off of groups, and they really despised one another. I mean, the Northern Kingdom men had married foreign women. They'd had these practices of worshipping in the high places. They had these other gods like Asherah thrown in, and they were just seen as anathema by the Southern Kingdom. And they evolved really into their own people and their own set of religious beliefs, which were very similar.
Okay.
There's not a lot of difference, really.
Mm-hmm.
But they just didn't get on, and they were always at each other in various ways. And it wasn't generally safe for Jews to travel back from the north through Samaria. They could be set upon, they could be persecuted, they could be beaten up. So you have Jesus in Matthew saying, do not go in the way of the Samaritans, just don't go there. Where Luke and Jesus and John's Jesus had no trouble at all going into the territory of Samaria and performing various miracles or having various discussions there.
So they were also looking for a Messiah. They were also believed in a Messiah coming.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's what I said. They're quite similar to the Jews. The differences are quite marginal, really.
Okay. Thanks.
But like if any family group that splits up or church split, they've got this bitter hatred of one another, and they both believe they're absolutely right.
Like the Catholics, the Catholics and the Protestants.
If you go back to the 60s, that's a good analogy. When Protestants call Catholic names and Catholics call Protestant names, and yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, the Samaritans were looking for the return of Moses. Because in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that Moses is the great prophet, the true prophet. So when the woman calls Jesus a prophet, that's a high acknowledgement by her. They were looking for Moses to come back apparently as the Taheb, which means the restorer, so that Moses would restore the good life that they had in the days, when they had their own kingdom. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so some questions. So do we think the woman believes Jesus could be the Messiah, and why? You won't get through all of these, but you might like to pick a couple. What is it that she has heard to make her think that? Why do you think the Samaritan people listen to her? And let me give you a tip. It's not because she's an outcast. John says many believed in him because of the women's testimony. Why do you think that could be so? And what are the risks for the woman in the story when she gives testimony about this Jewish man to a bunch of Samaritans? So you had a whole bevy of questions. How did you go tackling them?
There are so many questions, Elizabeth. I think we diverged a little bit.
I did tell you just to pick a couple. So did anyone have a go at why does the woman think Jesus could be the Messiah?
I think we thought there might be a heightened expectation in the community.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
I've been expecting the Messiah, and maybe there's been a bit of a filtering of news and stories that there's something afoot in the world. There's this person who's about. So maybe they had some expectations.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
Elizabeth, can I ask John a question? John said something that Samaritan believe that Moses will return as the Messiah. With my congregation as quite evangelical, John, any further reading on that? Point me in some direction where I can read more on that. It's just that that's answer a lot of questions I have a few years.
I used to teach that in the introductory synoptics course.
Okay.
Yeah, Otto. So you've probably heard it and forgotten it. I'll see what I can find about a easy to read material about that and send it to you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
It would seem to me that if the Samaritans, given that the Samaritans, I'm not doubting it, were expecting Moses, the fact that Jesus was talking about providing living water would line up quite well with a new Moses, because Moses, the first, provided living water for the people in the desert.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a good connection, yeah.
And they thought the Messiah was a prophet. That's the other important thing, which gives what the woman says in this particular story really important when she says, I see you are a prophet. And sometimes the Messiah is known as the Samaritan prophet when they're talking about it. So prophet is really important here. When she calls him a prophet, she's really ascribing a lot to him, more than if he's just out, in the Jewish desert doing his teaching. The way the Jews would use the word prophet is probably not quite the same way the Samaritans would use it. It has more loaded meaning for a Samaritan. Any other comments?
Well,
Why are the people of this town listening to her? Go on, is that Bill?
Yeah, well, as it says, you stayed there a couple of days there to spending time with these people, which is a fairly significant
teaching time
period of time.
Yeah.
Like not many towns got that benefit.
No, they didn't. And they make that request. It's not like Jesus said, I'll just park myself here for a few days. They ask him to stay because they want to hear more.
And because of his words, many became believers. 41.
Yeah, that's right. So he says things and people believe him. So why do you think that the Samaritan people initially listened to the woman?
Mm.
He must have had some status in the community. I just can't see any way around that. I know. So I agree with you, Elizabeth. I just think she must have had some standing in her community. Otherwise, they would have completely discounted it.
Yep, I agree with that. I mean, there's a lot made of the fact she's had 5 husbands, and that she probably was, and you'll read in the same breath, she had 5 husbands, so she probably was an adulteress or a prostitute. If she was an adulteress or a prostitute, 5 men would not have been found to marry her. End of story. There's just no argument about that. And commentators who say this sort of nonsense should be put in the bin because it doesn't make any sense in the ancient world. Women caught in adultery or known to be in adultery were stoned. People didn't marry prostitutes. That's not how it worked. So she can't be either of those things. But possibly this is an exaggerated form of the Levirate law, where she's been passed from brother to brother to brother as they die. We don't really know. The current man isn't said. It doesn't say she's committing adultery with the man she's currently with. He could be just to protect her, because we all know in the ancient world that women needed a protector. So he might have been her uncle or her Goel, the same way Boaz is meant to be in the book of Ruth. There's all sorts of things he could have been, but Jesus certainly never condemns her for sin or immorality at all. So we have to assume that she's not guilty of such things. So, but white male commentators through the centuries have latched onto this 5 husbands, applied a modern Victorian morality lens and judged her accordingly. What about the risk for the woman in the story when she comes and gives testimony to a bunch of Samaritans about this Jew she's found lurking around a well?
He's lurking with intent.
Well, I guess he is, because his intent is to get water.
And have a
Well,
rest.
there's reasons he'd be lurking around the well while he was waiting for his disciples, because most wells would have had some sort of shade around them. As a rule, they're what we think of as an oasis. Often there were steps down into them if they were big enough. They were sort of underground. and there would be trees, like at least palm trees planted around the top. So it was a place you didn't only get water, you could actually rest in shade as well. So it's a logical place to leave Jesus. Now, this well probably isn't one you walk down into because there's a need for a bucket. We can assume it's some sort of hole in the ground, I think, that you have to lower something down to actually access the water.
Would there be any meaning in the reference to well, like in terms of the collective memory of the people, like the wells were a meeting place for couples, weren't they?
Well, it's certainly wells where you have in some of the patriarchs, notably Jacob, meet up with their intendeds at wells. And I think Isaac's emissary sees Rebecca at a well. So, well, everyone had to use them. So it is a logical place where you would meet people. I don't know, it's quite the equivalent of a modern day pickup joint.
No,
but close enough.
Just we're looking for meaning in everything almost. We like the
That's right.
references we're trying to interrogate. What's the backstory to that reference?
I think that's reasonable in the Gospel of John, because John doesn't, he's, as well as being very poetic and a literary master, he's also very economic with his words in the sense that they all mean something. They're not just put there to fill out the story, they're there to mean something. I mean, this is the well that Jacob was, she says that, this is the well of our ancestor Jacob, where he met, I think it was Rachel, at a well. And so it has huge significance. I mean, Jews could have heard this story and said the Samaritan woman was obviously trying to pick up Jesus at the well or something like that. I mean, that's quite possible if this story was in circulation. They would be derogatory of it. But this is a hugely significant place where magic happens from God.
We had a whole other set of questions which we don't have time to look at.
Oh, you can think about them.
To the end of our time. So part of the purpose of these studies is not just to do what we do in this time, but to give you some material for your own reflection if you wish to. And I know that there are still people that had belonged to this group in the past that I still send the material to, and they tell me that they use that in their sermon preparations or reflections. So, but we do want to end just by noting that this woman does get a name in the evolving tradition, just as a number of the anonymous women in the Bible are given names in Orthodox churches or in the Roman Catholic Church. They're not in the biblical text, but they're in the evolving tradition of the church. So in Eastern Orthodox churches, this woman is canonized as Saint Fotini, and Fotini comes from the Greek word phos, which we know in English through photograph. Photo means light. So she is the saint who was enlightened, and she is often dressed, therefore, in red because that is the color of enlightenment. And I've done a little blog on that, which is referenced at the end of your resources, and I found this thread about Saint Fotini. And I should also note that Nicodemus, Jewish Pharisee as he was, is also canonized and became a saint in the church, and he shares his saint's day with Saint Joseph of Arimathea, obviously.
Strangely enough.
Because of what they did in receiving the body of Jesus. So that's on the 31st of August, if you want to remember Nicodemus then. And on the 26th of February, which has just passed, is the day for Saint Fotini. And here's the prayer that is prayed in Orthodox churches: illuminated by the Holy Spirit, O glorious one, from Christ the Saviour, you drank the water of salvation. With open hand, you give it to those who thirst. Great Mater Fotini, equal to the apostles, pray to Christ for the salvation of our souls.
And she
Interesting.
wasn't a martyr. There's nothing
No,
that
there's no
suggests
evidence that she was a martyr. But interesting that they're putting her as equal to the apostles. She was, in fact, the first evangelist in John's Gospel. All right, next week, Jesus and a man born blind, chapter 9. And this turns from a story which is an encounter into a story which is a drama in a whole lot of scenes.